welcome back to the pod.
Hey.
That's it. Everyone's hyped. This episode, everyone's on a hype train after reading some of this Thomas Pynchon.
Pynchon.
We've gone over all the pronunciations. We'll probably get to that a little bit later. This is going to be the first half of Vineland, which we also have been going back and forth between Vineland and Vineland.
Somebody at a bookstore, this is Danny, somebody at a bookstore told me I pronounced it Vineland when I asked him for a copy, and then he repeated back to me Vineland, and I don't think it's right.
I don't think so either. If we have a quick vote, I think it's Vineland.
I think it's Vineland.
But is it Vineland or Vineland?
I think it's probably, if it's a town, it's probably Vineland.
Yeah. I think Vineland is what I'm saying. Vineland sounds very...
Vineland?
Vineland.
I've been saying Vineland.
Yeah.
I'm going to look it up on the air, real time.
Real time.
Wow. Vinland.
Well, while that's happening, we'll get to that pronunciation a little bit later, but we're going to do our quick intro here. We're back down to 3 people on the pod. Our last episode, we had 4. Andrew joined us for Bluebeard, parts 1 and 2, but now it's back to the original trio. What's up, guys?
The OG trio.
OG trio.
Not much going on.
OG trio. So we're going to go around, and as we have done in every episode, we're going to introduce ourselves and say what we're drinking.
Hi, I'm Jamie. I'm drinking a drink that is made by Boulevard Brewing Co., but it is a gin and tonic fling craft cocktail, but in a can. So it's got cucumber and lime and gin and tonic water, and it's great.
Yeah, this is totally new for me.
Yeah, it's very fresh.
I don't think I've ever had a gin and tonic in a can, period.
I don't think
No.
I've ever had a gin and tonic in a can. I've had a gin and tonic. But this also is very lime heavy, I think, which is nice. I like it. Yeah, that's what I'm drinking.
I'm drinking a Boulevard Radler.
Who are you?
I'm Danny.
Danielle.
I guess
already
you
said-
technically already...
I did already say my name.
But
I
you need to
introduced my
clarify.
voice. I'm drinking a Boulevard Radler, and this is Danny. And before this, I was also drinking a Fling gin and tonic. What is it called?
Cucumber lime gin and tonic fling craft cocktail. I
That's
don't know.
a lot of
Yeah, it really
titles.
does look like that is the full title of this.
Yeah. I don't know.
I like my Radler.
Yeah.
It's great.
I am Brian, and I'm also drinking the cucumber lime gin and tonic fling craft cocktail.
So many words.
And it's fine and dandy for all of you that are wondering. It says right here on the can that it is fine and dandy. Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, but I also like the Danny pointed out earlier, the get me a G&T or GTFO on the can.
Oh.
I'm just going to make that my Instagram bio.
Also, tell your mom gin is yum.
I'm making that my Instagram bio.
This can, though I do like it, is quite extra. There's like a lot of different drawings.
It appeals to me as a female millennial.
Yeah, same.
Aggressively.
Same. I feel very seen.
I feel seen by this can. I want my life to be designed by this graphic designer.
This has been Brand Corner on Beer Time with Books.
Corner.
Although, okay, so we also need to bring this up. Before the pod, we ended up saying this as a joke, but the podcast is, as we've said in the past, Beer Time with Books. But today is a special edition because of this drink.
Gin time with beer.
No. Ginchon.
Oh, Ginchon. Yeah.
Jamie did suggest the name of the podcast be called Gin Time with Beer.
Yeah, Danny has a beer. It's perfect.
Books.
This is just us drinking on the air now.
Gin time with beer. Also, Ginchon. Or, as Danny would like to say, pinch gin.
Pinch gin. That's what I thought it was.
Ginchon is beautiful. So anyway, that's been the
Alcohol corner.
alcohol corner / brand corner / millennial awareness corner. And now we're also going to move into the recent media we've been consuming.
Most of my recent media has been on Quiltstagram.
Jamie Quilts is back.
Jamie Quilts is back.
You brought that up on a previous episode, took a brief hiatus. So it is on record when you started or around the time. But yeah, Jamie Quilts is back with highest ever engagements.
Yeah, shit, guys. I have an Instagram post, a picture on my Quiltstagram that has like 125 likes now, and I'm very excited. That's more followers than my account has. Somehow.
That reach, though.
Yeah.
Hashtags.
I've used
organic reach, baby.
hashtags very effectively. So that's been exciting. I've been quilting again. It's summer time. I don't think, was our last episode in the summer? No, it was like the last week of school.
Yeah, you were creeping along.
I was very nearly done. So it's summer and I'm not doing much. I'm quilting, which is exciting. I'm making a very cute book-themed quilt.
On brand.
Everyone.
On brand.
It's vaguely Alice in Wonderland themed. And Brian and I watched a lot of documentary now. That's it.
For the uninitiated, that's Bill Hader and Fred Armisen. They were the main actors. They weren't in this season as much as actors, but they were still listed as executive producers. And I'm pretty sure Seth Meyers is like the main writer, but everyone else contributes. But I'm pretty sure Seth Meyers is like the guy.
And it's parodies of famous documentaries. Each episode is like making fun of a famous documentary.
And they're really well done.
They're really well done.
Like the budget for these episodes had to have been so high.
Do you have to have watched the documentary in order to appreciate
you
it?
can get the vibe. There are some that I have seen the documentary that they're making. They tell you for the most part in the like bio of the episode, like this is a parody of blank. And there are a few that I have seen the actual documentary, and it did bring like a little bit more enjoyment to me. Like they did in this season, they had a 2-episode series of making fun of Wild Wild Country. Did you ever see that on Netflix? And it was enjoyable because they made it seem so much more insane, but also so many of the things they did in their parody like actually happened in the documentary, and I was like, oh no. Oh, this is a lot.
That one was a good one. It was a 2-parter.
Yeah, it was called Batshit Country. Was the 2-part episodes. So that's a good show.
Nice.
Speaking of shows, you guys have already watched this, but I watched Chernobyl, the first episode, yesterday. And it's crazy.
Yes.
And
Which episode did you say?
The first episode.
The first one, okay.
And I'm reading more about it also because I feel like it's not people talk about it just generally as like a terrible thing, but I feel like I never actually learned that much about it, and so I've been reading about it more.
It was so abstract because it was like a multi-day thing for the initial emergency, and then also, you know,
so
all of the work that they had to do weeks and months
Yeah.
later. Like everyone always just, well, I don't know everybody, but my mindset on it was like, I just knew it was, you know, at a nuclear power plant, there was a disaster. You don't think about the widespread ramifications of all of it, and it's crazy how like deep and wide it goes.
How many episodes is it? 10?
5.
Oh, it's only 5.
Just 5, yeah.
Yeah, it's really quick.
Wow. Well, I'm excited to watch more of that. I I've been listening to all of the regular podcasts that I've talked about a bunch on here. But I had another one that I wanted to bring up. I've been listening to Pod Save America, which is not super new, but I've been enjoying it. It makes me feel informed. It keeps me informed. And I'm also reading A Secret History by Donna Tartt, which I brought up last time. I'm still reading it. The first half of this book, put it on hold. Of this Pynchon book, put it on hold. But I'm almost done with it. It's been pretty long, and it's a very wild ride. I recommend it. It's weird, but I'm enjoying it. Yes.
Nice. Yeah, as Danny had mentioned, Jamie and I had been watching Chernobyl as of the last episode of the podcast, and we hadn't finished at that time, but we did finish it. It was amazing.
Yeah, it's really good.
Like
It's so
it
good.
continues to be amazing as each episode goes on. And what I appreciated at the end is, they go through. I think there is a specific technical term for this, but at the end of documentaries and sometimes at the end of movies as well, they'll do slow-mo shots of each person, and this one person,
like the real person.
yeah, went on to do this and that, and they clarified the things that were
made up a little
Yeah.
bit for the show.
exaggerated, or if
uh-huh.
or if a bunch of real people were combined to
And represented by
one person, because it's too difficult to have 20 different voices. So they did stuff like that showed what was actually real, which I thought was really cool. And then the stuff that was real itself was just insane. Just sci-fi for real. But
I think episode 3 was the hardest to watch, if I recall. Just so you're ready for that.
Episode 1 was pretty rough.
Yeah.
Yeah,
already.
episode 3 gets pretty gruesome.
So we watched that. I finished Tales of Dunk and Egg, the Night of the Seven Kingdoms short story collection from George R.R. Martin, which I enjoyed a lot, and it actually has me curious if some parts of that are actually going to tie into how the Game of Thrones Song of Ice and Fire book series ends, because of certain characters that are brought up within the later stories, because he started writing some of those during the latter books, because the first one was in the 90s, and so that was still within the first 3, but I think that there's some stuff that could maybe play into how he is going to end the books, which I think will be really interesting. And as I've mentioned on this channel many times, that I'm still excited to read those books, and so this kind of makes me more excited. And it was a nice thing after we all kind of brought up, we were disappointed in the end of the show. It was nice to revisit the world in a quality way, rather than just rewatching and knowing that things are going to eventually, nosedive to some degree. It was nice to go into the world and have the story that's actually good. And then last, I'm a big Legend of Zelda fan. I just got this. There's a Legend of Zelda game that just came out that I have been playing. That's a rhythm music game set to the Legend of Zelda overworld.
What?
So you do all the regular Legend of Zelda things, you get items and fight enemies and go to dungeons and classic Zelda stuff, but everything has to be done to a beat. So you're fighting all these enemies and it's to a rhythm, and it will let you know if you're missing the beat.
Is this a thing?
I
mean, is it a thing outside? Are there other things like this?
So apparently it is a different game series that does this rhythm style game, but this is a crossover, which makes it appeal to me because I like Legend of Zelda a lot. But it's just so funny because you do have to be very rhythmic. They make you calibrate your controller. It's every time Link jumps on the screen for 1 minute, press it,
like Guitar Hero.
So it knows if there's
Pretty
latency.
much,
Yeah,
yeah.
so it knows if there's
What?
latency, and then other things like that, and so it gives you your
It's
audio
fun.
and visual latency.
I
And I
haven't
like
played it. I don't think I'd like playing it, but I like watching Brian play it.
I think I would like it.
They remix all of these really classic Legend of Zelda tunes, and that's one of the reasons I like the game series so much, is the music is amazing. And so they do these remixes that are really cool, and so the whole time you're kind of jamming along. And then also it makes the strategy different, because instead of Legend of Zelda where you're open world or whatever, just doing what you have to do, it's always well, this enemy has this type of movement to this beat, and you have to do this beat, and well,
I need you to
I
tell
have-
okay,
I have
yeah.
never
I need you
heard
to
of
tell her the
anything
name
like
Okay, yeah.
of this
I did pull it
game.
up in preparation.
The name is so good.
So the name of the game is Cadence of Hyrule: Crypt of the Necro Dancer, featuring the Legend of Zelda.
The Necro Dancer.
I
Necro
know.
Dancer.
I have got to come over and
Oh
play
my
this.
god, yeah,
we can
it's
play it when we're done.
yeah,
with
I
this.
would love
it's
to.
it's so interesting, and the meta score for both users and critics, the critic score is at 86, and then user score, for some reason it's a different format, but 8.6. So essentially the same score, and that's high. So people are really liking the game, and I'm liking it a lot. So
This is revolutionary
Oh,
for me. I did
it's
not know that
amazing.
that was a thing.
It's
that
so fun. It's
existed
so
at all.
fun. So those have been the things that I've been consuming, and it sounds like we have quite the list there today, guys.
I also moved here closer to Jamie and Brian.
In this house, yeah.
Media that I've been consuming is looking at Danny's face a lot.
Yeah.
So. Media that I've been consuming is having Jamie and Brian, not just people, having Jamie and Brian people over to my house.
Yeah, so expect a spin-off podcast because Danny's just going to come over on random nights and we're just going to talk about
9 minutes away. 9 minutes away.
Also, seeing each other's faces, you guys work together.
That's true.
So I moved downtown. I live 9 minutes away from Jamie and Brian.
Updates.
This is Life Corner.
We have all the corners.
And I am the sole reason that Brian now has a job at my company.
Boom, sole reason. That's so true.
Also, he's qualified.
Also that. And so that also will
We're
be
on the same team.
Same team, and also for our guest that we brought up last episode, that'll be 2 episodes from now for our next book, which is Northwest.
And she's my coworker.
Yeah, so that'll be your coworker. So we're just gonna have work party.
Fish Tech v
X
a school district.
Fish Tech X school district crossover.
Yeah, we won't say which school district. Yeah. I feel like that's unprofessional.
Yeah, fair enough. So anyway, now that all the corners have been filled,
we've done all the
corners. We are moving on to the topic of this podcast today, which is Vineland by Thomas Pynchon. just a groan in the mic. Oh no!
I didn't mean to make a sound, but I am stressed.
So this is my favorite author.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just gonna throw that out there right off the bat.
Danny, is it your favorite author?
It is not, Your Honor.
So I'm gonna go into it saying this, that I've read now 6 of his 8 novels, and I would say that this is not up to the same standard as some of the other books of his.
Is this number 6 or number 7 for you?
This is number 7.
Okay.
So I have read 6. This is my 7th.
And this was written right after Gravity's Rainbow, right? Well,
yes, so,
17 years later.
So I want to get into that before we do the summary,
okay,
just to kind of give context to where this book sits at, because this is both of your all's first Pynchon novel, yeah?
Yes. Well, I've read short stories by Pynchon.
Right.
Oh, but I've never
read
a full
not the novel.
I have never read anything Pynchon.
Okay, so the way that this book came about was kind of interesting because of the nature of the author himself and the 2 books that came before and after it. So Thomas Pynchon is famous for his reclusiveness. There's only, 3 or 4 pictures of him online total.
He's still alive.
He's still alive.
Which I was surprised to learn when you first told me that.
Well,
me too.
Well, that's what's amazing about it. And I will, actively admit that that's part of what makes him so intriguing to me, is that this is a man who in the modern social media age has still been able to keep that privacy and yet has released, huge works of literature that you're able to dive into his mind space anyway without any, stupid comments on the side that affect it. It's all you're reading it and that's it. So he had released what a lot of people would consider to be his classic first 3. A lot of people separated his career into 2. And so the first 3 were V, Crying of Lot 49, and Gravity's Rainbow. And within those 2, or within all 3 of those, I think there's some, and I'm curious to hear your guys' take on this as well, just seeing it around, but those 3 all kind of have a reputation in and of themselves. V is on Barnes & Noble's book wall. You know how they have those big books that span the whole store? So that's a chain-wide thing, and V is up there, which is interesting. Wow. Crying of Lot 49 is probably his most read book.
That's the only one I heard about before I met you. before you told me you read Gravity's Rainbow.
And that one commonly gets discussed in academic settings as well. That's the one that's kind of...
Which one, Gravity's Rainbow?
Crying of Lot 49. So that's kind of transcended, just the popular appeal it's gone on to academic studies. And actually there's a couple free Yale English classes on YouTube that they release just one lecture just of hey, this is just a thing. If you want to see what a Yale lecture looks like, this is it. So they talk about Crying of Lot 49 for about an hour. A Yale professor talks about that. So kind of attest to that. And then Gravity's Rainbow, I would say maybe his most famous book, but not most read.
Yeah.
And that one has a reputation that precedes it of its difficulty and this and that. So I don't know if that's the case for you all. If you've heard of all three of those in some capacity, I don't know what it's like if you don't actively read his work.
I honestly, before Brian started reading Pynchon, he read his first Pynchon, I think, because I had it, which was Crying of Lot 49, right?
Yeah, Crying of Lot 49.
And I had bought that because I think I've said this before on the pod. Like, I get into like zones with reading where I'm like, I need to buy all of these books and read all of them. And that was like a classic 20th century American literature. Like, I got into a zone of that. And I also wanted to buy Gravity's Rainbow in that moment, but I couldn't commit to it because I was like, I haven't read Crying of Lot 49 yet, and it's much shorter. And
right.
I vividly remember specifically, I was on a trip in Los Angeles, and I was at the Last Bookstore, which is this beautiful giant bookstore in Los Angeles, and I stood there for like 20 minutes looking at Gravity's Rainbow, being like, I should buy this, but also I don't know. So I'd heard of those two. I don't think that I had ever heard of V until you started liking Pynchon. Also, I've read at least the first chapter of Crying of Lot 49 like 3 times. And I've never been able to finish it. So it's very short.
Yeah,
I should be able to read it.
Crying of Lot 49 is the only one of his that I'd ever heard of. Until you started talking a lot about him last year. I specifically remember you bringing that book to Kenna's wedding, our friend Kenna's wedding, because we were all... We stayed in a little lodge together with my partner foursome. Also. We had a little foursome room. And Brian was reading Gravity's Rainbow still. I recall that it took you a while to read it. It's very long. So those are the only two I'd heard of before Vineland.
Yeah.
Vineland, which I think it's Vineland.
Yeah. And so for those three, those are kind of the classic three, even though those are his oldest novels. I feel like those are the ones that have kind of pierce their way into modern literature discussions.
Does V stand for Vineland?
Okay, I thought they were the same for a very long time.
No.
I thought that, I know it's not, but when I thought that maybe V...
Danny, no.
Like, okay, no, but listen.
I love that you took this so seriously.
Because several times I thought maybe that they were the same book, and I like felt stupid for going to a bookstore and like looking for... Like, okay, Northwest by Zadie Smith. The book says it's just called NW, but it's not called NW. It's called Northwest. So that also had an effect. I was like,
for
V
Vineland.
is Vineland.
That's fair.
But it was very short because then I got to the bookstore and saw V and Vineland next to each other.
Right.
Anyway.
Fair enough.
Thank you for bringing that up.
I was just making a joke.
I know.
I wondered if V was the prequel to Vineland.
They're related.
And I'll get to that a little bit later.
Oh, are they actually? I don't know anything about this.
I'll get to that in a little bit later. But to the previous point, those first three are the ones that are really well known. And then Gravity's Rainbow was released in 1973. And his next book, after having this Gravity's Rainbow that was very famous at the time and considered to be a really pivotal part of the postmodern literature movement, it was then 17 years until he released Vineland. This is what he came back with after having this hugely influential, very famous novel come out.
What was his normal distance in between novels before that?
So I'm pretty sure Lot 49, V was 63, 49 was 67, and Gravity's Rainbow was 73. And I would have to check on that, but I think that's the case.
But it's shorter.
It's shorter. Okay. So 17 years later, he comes out with Vineland, and people are disappointed just from critical reviews. And that is...
really?
And the critical reviews of the time were like, oh, it's still, we still think it's a good book, but they're disappointed in comparison to Gravity's Rainbow.
What were the criticisms? Do you know?
So I'll have to wait to read them because I don't usually read critical reviews until after I finish. And so then to even contextualize it even more, so late career Pynchon starts at Vineland and goes on.
Okay.
So the book after this is Mason and Dixon, which is my favorite book of Thomas Pynchon's, and a lot of people consider it to be up to the same quality as like Gravity's Rainbow and some of the other big ones. But that's what it's bookended by is Pynchon has, this one hugely influential novel on one end, another one that maybe isn't as popular but does have a lot of critical appeal on the other end, and then there's Vineland in the middle. And so that's kind of the setup for this book is there was a gap. It was disappointing at the time because it kind of pulled the scope back of how he normally writes, and this was also revisiting a similar story structure that he again visits later. He has California novels, like people kind of categorize his work in that way as well. So he has these huge historical fiction novels like Mason and Dixon. Gravity's Rainbow is a World War II story against the days about the Chicago World's Fair, among other things. And then 3 of his novels have to do with California, and that'd be Crying of Lot 49, Vineland, and Inherent Vice. And so that's kind of an interesting part of his career is that he does revisit this California thing so much, specifically about, 60s culture in California, even though this novel's set in 1984, and I'll summarize what we've read here in a second. But that's also part of the context is this is one of 3 California novels of his, and this is the second one. So I just thought that that's kind of interesting from my own reading to also give context if you guys haven't read the other ones. So getting to the actual story itself, I'm going to try to summarize this one, which will be it'll be a time. So and I definitely, if you guys have anything to contribute, yes. just radio silence. So the one thing that kind of started the whole novel off strong was with Zoid Wheeler. He's jumping through a window.
I would like to point out that Brian currently has a Wikipedia page.
Just in case. And so Zoid Wheeler.
I could do that.
Zoid Wheeler has jumped through a window, and there's no explanation as to why yet. It gets onward to the next chapter that he gets a.
No, there is an explanation.
Well,
I disagree
the next
with
chapter.
That. No, it mentions it beforehand.
So regardless, he gets a check from the government that for mental disability.
Yes. He mentions that in the first chapter.
Okay, that's fine. So he gets that check for doing a crazy thing every year. That's the main stipulation, is that he has to do some, grand crazy thing every single year, and
to qualify him
to get this check still.
As crazy.
Right.
And so it's not always the window thing, but the last few years has been.
Yeah.
And he mentions that this year the window is particularly easy to break through, so maybe it's even more staged than even he knows.
It's like
because he said he's like
right.
This year it felt like it gave way right upon me touching it.
And then Hector starts eating it.
Mm-hmm. And so that's the setup we have with Zoid, who's presumably our main character, but we haven't seen as much of him in the latter half of our of this
Who's
part.
To say?
Who's to say?
He's maybe crazy, but also seems pretty with it.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know how he started getting those checks.
Right. And so all we really know is that he's of the hippie persuasion.
The hippie persuasion.
That's my Instagram bio.
There's a lot of.
He likes the weed.
He likes the weed. He likes the weed, and he really doesn't seem to have much of an income outside of these checks from the government, because we also get introduced to Zoid eating, what was it? Something with Nesquik on top of it.
Oh, right. He talks about Fruit
Loops.
Loops.
It was Fruit Loops with
and
Nesquik
with
on top
Nesquik
of it.
powder on top
Right.
of it.
Yeah, he doesn't Yeah.
And so that's when we get introduced to his daughter, who seems to be more of a main character to some degree at this point in the
She's
novel
at least a central character.
than Zoid is. But she's like, she has a weird relationship with her dad, and that like seeing him eating this food is like disappointing. Of like, you are a lazy hippie bum. But also she like still cares.
It's
for
like
him.
endearing.
But she's also a little bit like rebel of her era. Like, she wants to be kind of a hippie of her era. Her name's Prairie.
Yeah, her name's Prairie. But the thing is what continues to get brought up in the background of this novel is that it is now the 80s, and there are other characters that are of the hippie persuasion, but they're all kind of stuck in the past to some degree. It's kind of talking about, the hippie movement of the 60s, but then they're also continually referencing Ronald Reagan. They talked about Nixon a little bit as well, and the transition politically from the 60s to the 80s.
Right, yeah. This is supposed to take place the year of Reagan.
His re-election.
Yeah.
And so
it's 1984.
Yeah, and so it's definitely on their minds, and so that's kind of it kind of sets up an us versus them kind of situation, and the them in this case happens to be government agents. One of those being Brock Vond.
What a name.
And
Brock Vond.
And Hector something.
I don't know Hector's last name.
I don't either, actually.
And so
it doesn't matter.
And so we first get introduced to Hector, and Zoid starts to remember a past with Hector kind of harassing him and also wanting information, and would be willing to pay Zoid, but Zoid has not always been cooperative.
Yeah.
What kind of information does he want?
So I thought that it was about the other like
mostly drugs.
hippies, yeah.
Yeah.
other drugs.
It was like a lot of drug trafficking and different, like, Hector would give information about, like, this guy sold me weed. Or Hector always wanted Zoid to give that information, and Zoid was always kind of like, whatever.
Right.
Like, I
Right.
don't care.
And so with Hector, we also then find a relationship with Brock Vond, who it seems that Brock is his superior to some degree, and also has a tie-in with Zoid and Prairie in that he was involved originally with Zoid's ex-wife, Prairie's mother.
Fernessi?
Yeah,
Fernessi.
Fernessi. And so this starts to then lead into, the rest of the action of the novel. Once we start hearing about Fernessi, this is a person that Prairie's never met. She's very interested in knowing about her mom. But the reason that Hector and presumably Brock are coming back into Zoid's life, Fernessi was also on some sort of government program. It was a witness protection program. That program is ending or has ended, and so Fernessi is presumably also in some trouble.
Yeah, and he's, like, kind of free, but is maybe
She's
running.
like on the run a little bit.
And she might be running towards Zoid, so they want to track Zoid. But also, on the back burner of all of that, like, Brock is still a person. And then there's Hector is maybe running from an insane asylum. Can we talk about that?
Right. Well, let's finish out just to summarize, so we can get into deeper of a couple other things, just very quickly. And so that's the main part of the story of where we're at, is everything's kind of leading to rediscovering Fernessi, and the reason that they're also kind of on the run is that Brock has orchestrated something to get Zoid and Prairie out of their house. There has been a hit essentially on them, and so then all of these characters are beginning to get tied together, and we're kind of on a wild goose chase from there. I think that's a fair summary of where we're at.
Fernessi is like kind of the thread that
Ties
everybody
together.
together. But we haven't technically seen her yet. We've only
No.
seen her through flashbacks.
Right.
We haven't, like, really met
There's
her.
been nothing in the present yet, and so we're gonna leave it at that, because we're gonna get into a little bit more of the book and our thoughts on specific parts. But
Can I start
that's
with
kind of the
something?
main narrative arc. Yeah.
Because just it's on my mind and I want to start with. I hung out with a friend earlier today, and I was talking to her about this book. And I was describing it to her and some of the parts of it that I was like, this is weird and I don't know what's going on. And she said something about like, oh, it sounds, like, I hate books like that where sometimes the narrator is so unreliable that you'd blah, blah. And I was like, no, it's not. Like, I think I said Zoid was the main character, but then I was like, he isn't telling the story.
Yeah.
And
not really.
It's kind of an omniscient third person, but also there are parts of it that I'm like, that does seem like somebody's just tripping and I don't know what's happening. So part of that, first, Hector is maybe crazy. It says that he's being treated for like TV addiction.
Oh yeah, I read about that.
He like escaped from an insane asylum where he is obsessed with the Brady Bunch, and
they call it the tube in the book.
Yeah, the tube. And then the other part, which is way later, but the part with after Zoid is in Hawaii and he's on the airplane and the other airplane like connects with his airplane, and I'm like, what is going on right now? So I don't know.
Danny's just shaking her head.
I think part of this, I wanted to ask Brian specifically if I'm supposed to take this seriously, like if it's,
don't ask me,
if it's kind of like a science fiction or if it's somebody is on drugs.
I was taking it as science fiction. It makes me think of Vonnegut.
I know, but also it's so much more like the narration is so much more serious than Vonnegut that my brain can't handle it.
Yeah.
So this is something that we were talking briefly earlier today where I was like, well, we'll save it for the pod just because.
You talked about it together.
Hashtag save it for the pod.
Earlier.
And so I had mentioned there's a couple things about Pynchon's work that kind of ties them all together, and I'll revisit something that we also talked about earlier in the podcast here in a second. But one of the things that Pynchon does have is a lot of zaniness to his novels. There's a lot of absurdity there. The thing here is I don't know that absurdity was done quite well as the reasoning as to why it's happening. So in other instances of books where he's had this absurdity, there's been really good reasons as to why. And it may tie into how he does it in another book, but in Mason and Dixon, there's a story getting told. It's a frame narrative, and so the narrator, depending on who's in the room, is telling a historical story. But if there's young children, he'll start being like, oh yeah, and when they were crossing the river, like, a monster was there or something.
Fairies
but it all makes sense because it's in the frame of this story. So anytime you're back, in this room where the guy's telling the story, it's all completely normal.
Right.
In Gravity's Rainbow, it's a similar thing where there's a lot of history there, but it makes, if you're paying attention, very good use of letting you know when somebody is under the influence of something. Mm-hmm. And in this case, in World War II, you're talking about some of the horrific parts of war, and some of that was a legitimate truth serum, quote unquote, that the Germans would use on people that actually made people hallucinate. And so if somebody's getting told from like their point of view and they had just had that, then all of a sudden the narration is going nuts. But it's because of that.
Is this truth serum?
And so in this case, there is reference to like their drug use, but because the narration seems to,
it's pretty seamless,
not slip in necessarily to somebody's point of view necessarily. It seems kind of weird. So that'd be the only thing, is that I feel like anytime I've read his other stuff, it seems to be that, there's something influencing why it's wacky. Not always, but I don't know that was always there on this one. So I think that it was tackled better in other novels.
This is the thing. Like, we don't know. We have no reason to trust the narrator or know who the narrator even is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So we have no context about the narrator. So we don't know, like, you're just going along and all of a sudden there's aliens in airplanes and other things. Like, it's very, like,
the narration moves so smoothly, and like it feels just like here's a flashback to another very real thing that very much
and
happened.
you feel like you're in a flashback, like you feel like you're in a flashback that happened, like you're being told a story that's happening or has happened, and then there's a flashback that also has happened.
So that's the only thing that I would think of, is because there had been circumstances in previous novels where there was a reason, because this novel seems to be so flashback heavy. that maybe by, the fact that it is a remembering and a retelling, that like details are fuzzy, and that may be the reason as to why.
But like, what's the point? Like, what is the...
Also, that doesn't answer the question about Hector, I don't think. Because the stuff about Hector was in real time. People showed up being like, he escaped from our institution.
Well, I would assume that that's true.
But that seems wacky. That he's addicted to the Brady Bunch. Like, I don't...
It happens, though.
Is it a commentary? Is it like a satire on like
what is
TV
what's that
becoming a
TLC
thing?
show? The My Strange Addiction? Like, I'm sure...
Like, I'm addicted to crying.
Yeah, like, you could be addicted...
I've seen that.
You could be addicted to the Brady Bunch.
Yeah, I mean, he hums the Flintstones tune. I don't know. I just feel like it... There are so many moments where I was kind of like, but...
Yeah, and that's
don't...
and that's fair. That's totally fair. Like I said, I think that there are other instances where some of that was tackled maybe a little bit better. But that's why I'm glad to like be talking about a book that, like I was telling Jamie this earlier, like if we just choose certified like home run classics for every episode of the podcast, then it's just us being like, oh my God, it's so good. Like it's cool to kind of discuss
Or like hot takes.
like flaws in
Yeah.
novels, which I find interesting as well. And so one of the things that does kind of tie this into other novels is that Pynchon does have a style. And so somebody, I think it was you, Jamie, said something about, is it tied to, like, is V a prequel to Vineland? So similar to Vonnegut, Pynchon has character crossovers that presumably every single book is in the same universe.
Okay.
And that there's a character from Crying of Lot 49, I haven't seen it yet, is in this novel. And there are other instances where even if the novel takes place in the past, it's somebody that has the same last name, so it's like a generational connection there. Mm-hmm. So presumably, because V takes place in real time in the 60s, and this is an 80s thing, they may be in the same universe.
It may be a prequel.
A quote-unquote prequel, yeah. So in a lot
have
of...
Have you read V?
Yes, I have.
Why don't
It was an early one for me.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I thought that was one of the ones you had left. What's the one you have left?
Against the Day is the last novel after this one.
Okay.
And so that's part of it, is that they all kind of tie together, and also he has classic tropes that he does. A lot of it is historical. It's set in some, real time on Earth. Like, it's never like a crazy sci-fi thing, even though sci-fi things happen in the middle of the story. So it's usually historical, highly referential to the time period. In this book in particular, we get, anytime there's a movie mentioned, it's like the year that it was released in it. A lot of other parts of the 80s, like the politics as well. A lot of references to those. Songs are in every single novel. There's been a few in this one so far. Paranoia, usually by way of drugs. So that was in here as well. A ton of characters, usually in the novels, and then also the disjointed nature to some degree. So those are kind of classic Pynchon tropes. So out of all of those, like, has there been particular like stylistic things that you have enjoyed in the midst of this disjointed narrative? Like, are there particular stylistic things that you have found to be unique in his writing? And maybe not, but I'm just curious.
There's one really, really small thing that I wanted to point out to you guys that I don't know if anyone else noticed, but I kept noticing it. We already said, Hector kind of disappears, maybe. But in the first few chapters, Hector is there a lot, and they have a lot of conversations with Hector. And Hector is Hispanic, but every single time he talks, he's speaking English in a normal way for the most. He occasionally does some Spanish, but whenever there's an I in a word that Hector says, the dot above the I is like an italicized.
Oh yeah.
Like a little accent.
A little accent,
yeah.
Hispanic I, and it kept making me laugh. Like, every time I was like, this is so goofy. Like, it's giving him an accent without actually telling me.
It's like a little characterization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something small that I thought was funny and nice.
Yeah. And that's a thing that I like about his work too. I guess that's not on the list of what I said, but he does give a lot of character to people's speech patterns.
Yeah, he very specifically
he wants you to read it a particular way.
Spells things and says things. Like when certain people are talking, especially in this in the last chapter before we ended like the last 60 pages, he only spells the word really RILLY.
Mm-hmm.
Like he specifically spells it that way, and he puts like he replaces letters at the end of words with apostrophes, and like he does a very specific job of I don't know, like emphasizing like speech, like people's speech.
Yeah, and I like that. And there's other novels where like he usually does a lot of research from, you know, if you look at the references that he puts in his novels, they're always a real thing, and he does it in a context that's correct. And in Mason and Dixon, they had been speaking in, you know, old English. It's colonial America, and he does a good job of like getting accents if they're in other countries, that he tends to actually try to be as accurate as possible within those ways of speech. So it's funny that you bring that up, because like that's the thing that I do like about him is even though the dialogue is wacky, it is very stylized.
Yeah, it's specific. I also did, you already kind of mentioned this, when he mentions a movie or a song or whatever, and puts in parentheses like 1984 or whatever, I thought that was funny every time. I was just like, it feels like you're citing it, and right. I don't understand
but it's
why.
it's like Ghostbusters though. Yeah. like it's not anything that serious.
Also, aren't a lot of them 1984? I feel like the year the book is written,
right?
Or I mean, the year that the book is supposed to take
place. Yeah. So that's a late era Pynchon thing. Like he started doing that this book onward, and the one that's really fun on that one, which I think, depending on who it is, a good entry point to his work. Bleeding Edge is his most recent one from 2013, and the references in there are all like millennial references.
Oh, that's funny.
Because it's the time period that we were growing up.
Yeah.
Like the characters in that book match up really well.
Yeah,
and so it'll be like Pokemon, like whatever your Pokemon is, and different things like that. And I really thought that those were funny in that instance too, because it's just like, these are me, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what's kind of interesting about his work is like, because there's one set in the modern age, you start to realize it more, which helped me appreciate his previous stuff. But with all of those references that he has and their accuracy, it's hard to relate to sometimes, because like we're not children of the 80s. And so like reading a book that is in the 80s, and a lot of these references are of that time and of the current political, battlefield at that point in time as well, that can be a hindrance to getting into the novel. Whereas if you get into a more modern one, the references are like, oh my God, like it's funny because you know them. Mm-hmm. So, and so with that, we had talked about it a little bit, but there have been some themes, and there are things that are tying the book together. What are you latching onto right now, and like what kind of themes are you seeing pop up in your reading? Because I think we've all had some difficulty with a lot of this story so far. Like even for me, I've had trouble following sometimes, but there are certain threads that have been able to allow me to keep going and really find a path through. So I was just curious for like what that is, and then any other themes that you have seen arise.
I mean, like I said earlier, I feel like Frenessy is it was very unexpected. I mean, I feel like I started the book just thinking like, oh, Zoid is the thing, and then Prairie is maybe secondary or whatever. But it took me a little while to get into it and realize that Frenessy was like the thread that ties everybody together. And like to realize that they're all kind of searching for her in some way for different reasons. And it's also like an interesting angle to go straight from Zoid to Prairie hearing these stories like about her mother.
Right.
That's maybe more recent, but like the last 70 pages before the end of the first half. But I also really like, I'm realizing more and more, like maybe you guys could have told me this about my reading style before I like am realizing it, but like my enjoyment of a book is like very heavily tied to how much I can like understand what's happening. And earlier Brian said something about I was at work and I was making a like a character chart. I was making a little, because I was like, all of these characters, and there aren't even that many, I guess, compared to his other books. But Brian was like, oh, you would never be able to do that with Gravity's Rainbow. And I was like, I would have to. And he was like, it's not important. You shouldn't do that. And like,
some people do.
I mean, yeah, but like like for my own enjoyment, like comprehension and understanding and organizing and latching onto structure. Like when you asked what we were enjoying, my first thought was that I could see that each chapter was like kind of a different story, and like through it all, that was really helpful for me because they all feel really disparate to me, but at least I can like latch on to each chapter as like its own story. So it's like not a surprise maybe, but it's like for me, like latching onto any kind of structure like is tied directly to how much I'm enjoying it. So being able to find structure in the first place was like
a win
for me. But also like some people are very okay. Some people are very
right at me.
Are very okay with like not having that kind of structure or not needing that kind of like I need to know what every character is doing, or like I would not like spending
to
time
mention,
on that.
just as a tangent to this, Brian has read books before. There's one in particular that I'm thinking of. Oh, that's back there. JR, maybe?
I haven't read that.
No.
But the Recognitions,
The Recognitions by that same author. Where Brian specifically told me, he was like, there are like literally 200 characters and you're not supposed to know who they are. And he fucking loved that book. Like he was like,
gives me the most anxiety.
He kept telling me like, I don't know. I don't know. But I like it. And I was
Jamie and I were having a conversation before the pod, before we started recording, where we were talking about like a whole storyline, or like a mini storyline of what was happening between two characters toward the end of the first half, and Brian was like, it's fine, it's not important. And I'm not trying to say that as like he doesn't think that things like very important things are not important.
Sure.
But like I feel
just feel attacked.
No, I don't. I
just feel that I need that kind of thing.
Well, that's the
even
thing
if
is,
this sticky note of character organization is unnecessary.
Yeah.
It helps me enjoy it.
See, I'm just not in it for that. A lot of the books that go into those different directions, a lot of those are just, with as many characters as there are, they are just kind of serving a tropey purpose sometimes that like I've learned to not like get hung up of being like, oh, well, who was just saying that thing like 20 pages ago? They serve their purpose in the story of just being like this caricature. And that's what I like about it. And then other than that, the stories go into these directions where I learn a lot because it goes into all these different directions, which that's what I find enjoyable. And so that's why, like, I'm not approaching it of just like, I don't really care. I've just learned to not, and I learned to latch on to the ones that I know are going to continue playing such a big role.
I think we talked about this with Lincoln and the Bardo, because when we first started reading Lincoln and the Bardo, I also tried really hard to pay attention to who, like, the different citations were from.
Oh, yeah.
In the historical chapters. I was like, oh, do I need to remember who this person is who said that it was stormy that night?
Right.
Like,
and it didn't bother me.
And it didn't.
Like, I was already used to that.
Important.
Yeah. To me, like, I just briefly gazed at each of those and was just kind of like, meh, like, I get what they're doing. Like, that's just,
I was like taking frantic notes.
Like, that's just the kind
about
of
each citation.
Yeah, and like that's
Tallying.
what's interesting is like that's why some of these books appeal to certain people. Is like
I think
not
also,
everybody
like,
wants to do
you're
that.
You're right. Like you said, several times you've gotten used to it, and like it takes reading an author a lot of times to understand. Like I feel like how many Vonnegut books have I read now? 4 or maybe 4 or 5. Like I feel more equipped to understand Vonnegut because I read several of them.
Yeah.
And so I feel like you're right. Like you are maybe more equipped at approaching this book because.
And this is admittedly tough, and like in my opinion, like no, again, Pynchon's my favorite writer, but like this is definitely a weaker work.
I think it's interesting though to start with like that's what I love about like us doing this podcast too.
Yeah, me too.
Is like starting with what?
I want us to hold hands while you say this.
This is what I love about podcast.
Jamie and I are holding hands.
Okay.
What I love about doing this podcast is that I'm reading books. I'm reading.
Danny's crying. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, I'm weeping. We had to cut because I was crying too hard. I'm reading books that I maybe would never have picked up or would have bought and then kept on my bookshelf for 10 years before I read them. And also, I think it's really interesting to your inaugural I don't know, book.
Your introduction to an author.
Yeah, to an author is not their most famous and not even their second most famous.
Yeah, this is way down.
This is at the
bottom.
Yeah.
For
so
sure.
I think that's interesting. I think that's cool.
Yeah. I've been enjoying it.
What question am I supposed to
So the things in the midst of the
Just
chaos.
keep holding my hand.
The things in the midst of the chaos that you're still that you're grasping onto that are allowing you to move forward, the things that you're kind of drawn to, and then themes that are arising.
Okay. Just as a side note, themes that are arising.
If you have them.
I really like Prairie's character. I feel like every time Prairie comes up, I get excited. I don't know why. I don't know what it is about her, but I'm interested in her storyline as the kind of
She seems the most normal, honestly.
Yeah, she feels very sympathetic. She just wants to know who her dad is, and also she kind of has this weird boyfriend, but also she's
named
sort of
Isaiah.
Isaiah 2:4.
2-4 of the Vomitones.
Of the Vomitones. Classic.
But she also kind of just ditched him to do her own thing, and I think that she's cool, and I like her. So every time she comes up, I'm like, oh, fuck yeah.
What's Perry gonna
What's
do?
Prairie doing?
Yeah.
What's she up to?
Yeah.
So that's what's keeping me hanging on.
Keep me hanging on.
Yes.
Themes.
Sing it.
Insert that right there, editor.
Themes. I feel like paranoia and
Always a theme.
and exploitation
Yeah.
are very prevalent. There's a lot of talk of using sex as a way to get information or something out of a person. That's a huge thing that's happening in the background of this that they glaze over every time it's mentioned.
Yeah, and it's interesting in the context of the free love aspect of, because those are big chunks of characters are hippies, free love, and how that relates and how it isn't that quote unquote big of a deal.
Yeah, because
certainly is.
That for Nessie, that's her job is to sleep with people to get information for the FBI. I'm pretty sure is what her job is described as, and kind of the same with DL.
Yeah, it was very sex worker-ish.
Yeah, but for the government,
Right.
And it's I don't know. There's a lot going on there that I think is interesting, but I'm also confused about because the way that they talk about it is weird. They mention it so briefly at certain points that you're kind of I'm sorry, what did you just say?
It's a casual job that they're going to or something.
And then also at in the last chapter, we're talking to DL and Takeshi, or maybe to Prairie, and Takeshi says oh, there's a child in the room, I should tone it down. And so then I'm are you lying to me? What are you saying? I don't that's a lot. Those are my thoughts.
Yeah, that's an interesting theme.
Yeah. So just because of the time here, I'll kind of say my piece on this, and then if you guys have any other final thoughts, I'll kind of tie final thoughts into mine. But as far as what's keeping me going and for final thoughts purposes on, what I think will happen in the back half and what I've kind of thought of the first half so far, what is keeping me going is I always know that within Pynchon's novels, the main characters will continue to move forward, no matter if it's on a snail's pace or not. And that's something in this one that I kind of have talked about with Jamie, is the pacing of this, I think, is part of what is kind of pulling me out of it, in that other Pynchon novels, when things swerve away from the main character, they are back. Even if it is a long time, it still feels appropriate. I feel in certain instances, Zoid, where's Zoid? We haven't seen Zoid for a long time.
We haven't seen Zoid since chapter 4.
Yeah.
And we're in chapter 10
Well, that's supposed to be
now.
just a distraction. I don't
So, well, that's the thing is like I think that things will come back to Zoid, which I'm excited for, and I'm continuously curious about Fernesi and Prairie, and that I think that after because this is kind of a cheating thing, but in doing some research about the book before talking about it today, there were some threads on Reddit that a lot of people that had read Vineland didn't like the Japan section that we had just read. It was like a 60-something page chapter.
More, because it's 2 chapters. It's not you.
Okay, yeah, that's true. So the last chapter is 60, but the 2 combined, it's more than that. And so a lot of people had issues with that in particular, and I think that took focus away from, after...
I felt like I was reading a whole other book.
Yeah, and after introducing Zoid in an interesting way, I thought that the beginning was pretty compelling of
the first
setting
chapters
him up.
were really engaging. I think.
And so I think that now that we're kind of moving presumably away from that section, I think that the back half will hopefully focus on our main characters a bit more, and I think that will be really cool to kind of see how things resolve with this family, because I feel like there's going to be a lot of more personable things, more emotional things as the family's story starts to converge, which I think will be really cool in the midst of all of this wackiness. I think that it'll be interesting to see how that family dynamic plays out in the end. As far as the themes that have been kind of interesting, and this is just something I've seen from blurbs forever and that I hope gets addressed a bit more, but the difference between the 60s and the hippies and the 80s and the narcs, essentially, how the political landscape has changed, because I think that a lot of times with Pynchon's California novels, he was definitely in the midst of some very hip movements at the time. When he was writing, he was kind of a more in line with the beats. That's how he came up a little bit, and then was writing similar to their style with V, and then kind of transforming into his own thing later on. But he always keeps revisiting with the California novels this idea of the 60s dream dying, which I think is tackled really well in other novels of his. Obviously there's something on his mind about it that it's where did it go wrong? This is something that a lot of people are this is the utopia of America. And that seemed to fall off a cliff. Then we get into, a big swing to a more conservative country, more conservative politics. So I think that dichotomy is interesting, especially since we've already gotten a glimpse of that so far. And I'll be curious to see how that plays out in the back half as well. But just to sum up my thoughts about it so far is a little underwhelmed, but I have hope for the promise of the back half. And if you guys have any other final thoughts, for sure.
I want to hear Danny's thoughts on the first few chapters.
Well, so they both at the same time said that they thought the first few chapters were really engaging, and interesting. I don't know. I feel the opposite. I was the most engaged. I was all over the place. I felt super frenetic and anxious the whole first. I kept picking it up to read it, and I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't know who we were even talking about. I kept meeting new people and then going back to the first and second and third chapters and trying to figure out if I'd already met them. Mm-hmm. So I felt part of that also was me just not enjoying it because I couldn't latch on to anything, but I actually really much very much enjoyed the last the Japan section.
Which is interesting considering
I think part of it was because it reminded me a lot, not just because it was an Asian country, but it made me think of, I've read a few of Haruki Murakami's books lately, and in the last year, and his are pretty absurd also, and it made me there was that scene where they're in a hotel room or something, and they're and she thinks he's Takeshi is Brock Vond, and it was all so absurd and weird, and it just made me think of several chapters from several different books of Haruki Murakami's writing, and I was able to kind of draw a parallel and latch onto something. And so those last 80 pages of the first half made the most sense to me, but also were the most interesting to me. So I was really engaged the last, the last like half of the first half.
Yeah.
That's interesting. I feel like I liked the first 3 chapters a lot better because I also have a reference that they reminded me of. Like, I kept thinking about the Big Lebowski.
Oh, yeah.
Like, that's the image I had in my mind of, like, who Zoid was, is the dude from the Big Lebowski. And I think that helped me, and it gave me, like, a sense of where the book was going. Like, in my mind, the first 3 chapters, I kept being like, okay, here's, like, this old hippie guy who, like, very much reminds me of the dude from the Big Lebowski. And then suddenly it verged way off of that.
Yeah.
Like, it veered to the left hard. And so I was more confused during the Japan chapters than I was engaged, because I was just kind of like, wait a second, there was the dude back there, though. Like, I want to get back to, like, I don't understand. Let's talk about Zoid and the hippies and the weird, I don't know, drug stuff
agents
and FBI
aliens.
agents and whatever. So that's interesting that we both kind of had like
opposite
media.
Yeah.
I like that though.
influences.
I like that though. That's kind of cool. Because I think there's been a lot that we've all like converged opinions on for previous books. So like I also like that this book is giving us, different things to focus on.
Yeah. I don't really have any other final thoughts. I want to see where it goes. I want to understand the ending for Nessie and whoever else, but I don't know.
I want to read. I don't know if either of you have this on the backs of your books, but I am like such a person who needs all the context I can get before I read a book. Like, I will look it up and sometimes even read a synopsis of it before I read it, because I just feel like I need something.
I'm not like that, to be clear.
Shocked. So I read the back of this book actually several times. Every chapter, I think I read the back of the book. I'm serious.
Give me help, please.
Give me help. I need to read one of the last sentences, though. It says, the novel begins with such a jump and thereafter fragments into myriad different narrative shards. But at the end, the pieces all leap off the floor and fit miraculously together as if a film were being run backward. And then it says, Prairie is obsessed with her vanished mother, and so is everybody else in the novel. So is Zoid, so is Brock Vaughn, who is her lover and who turned her from a radical filmmaker. The child of a... anyway, it keeps going and going. But
that's interesting about the ending, though, that they bring that
Mine
up.
doesn't say that.
So it specifically says, it almost like it reads to me kind of like a hook, like don't give up halfway through, because like it's all gonna come together eventually.
Yeah, that's cool.
And so honestly, like that is what is like
the motivation. Is
I mean,
the back
it like
of your
is
book.
motivating for me to just be like, okay, it like something is going to wrap up. Like I'm not gonna be like dissatisfied. Like I know that it'll wrap up to Zoid. I feel like we're so far from Zoid right now.
Yeah.
We've
That's why
spiraled far.
Yeah, I said that.
And we're gonna come back to him.
That I think the back half will revisit them more heavily.
Yeah.
I think that for sure it will happen. And that's the thing when you're talking about the characters as well, in that, it's difficult to know who to focus on. The thing that's always been really nice in Pynchon novels is, with the same idea that I had talked about, is that some of them are less important. As you continue to go on and people aren't referenced again, it gets easier to
parse through
to watch, because just by natural way of reading. But like it is helpful in a novel with so many characters to just like also have that mindset of when it's difficult, it's like you're gonna know who to focus on because they're gonna be there. Like it seems like a simple thing, but like if you just think of it in those terms, like you just know who's going to end up having resolution, which presumably is going to be Zoid, Prairie, and Nessie. So
right.
Yeah. Cool.
Nice, guys.
Super cool, dude. Super cool. So that's part 1 of Vineland by Thomas
Ginchon.
Yeah, this has been the latest episode of Ginchon.
Gin time with beer.
We'll have to have gin next time as well.
Yeah, this is our special. Ginchon is a real thing.
I will make gin cocktails next time.
So yeah, that will be good for this week. We will be doing page. Oh, sorry. Page 2 for next week, everyone. If you can handle that, just the second page.
Page 2. We'll only talk about the second page.
Yeah, part 2, and then just because I think, as I've done the last couple of episodes, since we've kind of discussed this, and also to revisit this idea, we're in the back half of season 1. Woot woot. So just to say how we're going to round out the end of the season, it's going to be Vineland part 2 for me.
Then we're reading Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead, and we will have a super special guest.
Woot.
Woot. And then to finish out the season.
A season finale.
We have a season finale. Northwest by Zadie Smith.
We have a real season finale, though. Remember?
Yeah, we're gonna review
retrospective.
everything.
Oh yeah, no,
Yeah.
you're right. We're gonna do that.
But you're
But
the
you're
last
the.
book.
But yeah.
Be
It
excited
counts.
about mine, please.
So yeah, Andrew was our resident scatter last 2 episodes, so now he's gone. So how
So
are we?
Danny,
I'll take it.
Yeah,
Up.
how are we
I'll
doing?
take it up.
Hit it.
Beep a doopy, ba doo bop, beep, bow.
Beep.
wow.
We will catch you next time.